Welcome to Casual Politics. Neil Kinnock, thank you very much for accepting my request, and I'm very grateful to you. You need no introduction. You've been leader of the Labour Party from 1983 to 1992, and then Vice President of the European Commission. So my first question is, how did you get involved into politics?
That goes back a very long way. I came from a family that wasn't actively political. My people weren't members of the Labour Party. They were members of trade unions. But they had a set of values and history that was conveyed to me with a mixture of seriousness and humour that made me aware from a very early age of two things really. First of all, things were not all right with the world. And secondly, if you wanted to change things in the right direction, you had to do it with others, collectively and in organised fashion. And that was underlined by things like my grandparents' history, their memories of the Great Depression in the 20s and 30s in South Wales, particularly harsh, their wartime memories for the First and the Second World War and the sacrifices made, their stances on things like the Civil War in Spain between 1936 and 39, those kind of things. Not in any lecturing, serious, hectoring form, but simply as part of conversation, people they knew, activities and occasions they remembered and so on. And I think that from all three of my living grandparents, that was apparent, as it was from the wider family, which had been greatly dispersed as the result of the Great Depression. All of the boys except one had started off as coal miners and then had, because of unemployment, had to travel all over the country, with the exception of my father and my eldest uncle, who continued to work in the pits. And then my mother was a district nurse, and occasionally I would go out with her during school half terms and other times, simply for company or because there was nobody else to look after me. And I would see people's homes that were not like our homes. I was a working class household. We had a prefab, 2-bedroom prefab, which was quite a modern dwelling, very pleasant. There was culture at home, music and literature, good conversation. And I really realized that other people's homes were much poorer than ours, that they were bereft in terms of finance and in terms of ideas, understanding, breadth. And all of that was bound to make me feel a strong sense of injustice and a strong desire for justice. So that sounds terribly solemn. It wasn't a bit like that. It was very loving, lots of laughter, great fun. And nevertheless, it left me by the age of 14 understanding that if I was ever going to do anything about it, I should get engaged politically. And on January the 1st of the year in which I was 15, so 3 months before I was 15, I joined the Labour Party locally and wanted immediately to get stuck in. That wasn't easy to do. It was a very safe Labour seat with a very established set of councillors and autocrats of various kinds. So it took me a long time to break through. But that was the beginning, and it continued through university with various activity. I was fortunate. Through it, I met my wife, who was already, when I met her, in her first week in university, poor girl, a member of the Labour Party. She was very beautiful. That helped. But, we've been a political partnership ever since. And really, it dates from all that. So that in my adolescence, I was interested in sport, especially rugby football, girls of all kinds, and politics. Not always in that order, but most of the time, some of the time girls came first.
So very exciting reasons to get involved into politics. And your hero as a child, it was Bevan.
Yes.
And how was it to go and to go to his conferences and to listen him speaking in those conferences?
Yes.
How was it as a child?
Well, there wasn't a phone ringing. That was one thing. That'll stop now. Nye, as people may or may not know, was a quite remarkable character. He'd left school at 13, become a coal miner, then at the very early age of 19 was elected as a miners' representative, virtually unknown in those days. Highly articulate, imaginative, courageous, a real champion. And that's not being in any sense romantic. Everything ever produced about his life underlines that. And he was dauntless. And the great thing was that he brought poetry to politics. Partly because in order to overcome a serious speech impairment, he learned page after page of Shakespeare and Milton and Wordsworth and the Bible, and would recite those pages at a loud voice, walking on the hills around what was both our hometown of Tredegar in South Wales. The fact that he was our local MP was inspirational in itself, and the fact that he was literally worshipped by the huge majority of working class people in that constituency added to his remarkable reputation and charisma. Even more important in many ways than the poetry and the daring that he brought to politics and to life. He was a builder. It was he who was appointed by Claimant Attlee with huge courage himself to become the Minister for Health and Housing in 1945 in that post-war Labour government. And Nye immediately set to work in trying to generate an absolutely essential level of affordable house building, and even more important, the establishment of the National Health Service. And he modelled the service on the local system that existed in Tredegar, which was a workman's benefit society, where all the workers in employment paid in every week a penny a week to build up a collective health service that meant that despite the fact that there was no free provision, would give every person who contributed direct access to a general practitioner and to nursing services, and when necessary to the finest specialists in the country in Harley Street and the other great heights of the medical profession, free. And even travel and accommodation was paid out of the Tredegan Workmen's Society Fund. And it was those principles of good administration, collective contribution, and free healthcare at time of need, which are installed in the National Health Service, and means that we have, according to the OECD, the best and most moderately costing health service in the whole world. It could be vastly improved, of course, and I believe that it should have more funding. But nevertheless, we're talking about 1948 by the time the health service started, and it is Bevan's living monument, and it demonstrated that he wasn't just a great orator, which he brilliantly was, in Parliament and on the conference floor and in rallies and meetings in the open air, but was a truly creative political genius who used power for its proper purposes, the resolution of the challenges facing humankind. And that was Nye. Now, I couldn't fail to be impressed by him. I would have been, even if he hadn't been from the locality and for the locality. But the fact that there was this sense of proximity put him in the pantheon of heroes. And together with the great sportsmen of the age, all Welsh, I have to tell you, Bevan was there alongside John Charles, Il Gigante Gentile, and Gilbert Parkhouse, the opening England batsman, and the great boxers that we produced. And there was Nyren Bevan in my youthful consciousness alongside all those.
And I think it was Nyren Bevan who said that there are two rules in politics, whether you do politics with poetry or with plumbing. So which one did you choose when you became the leader of the Labour Party?
Well, I think that the alternatives are not authentic. As Bevan himself showed, and one or two other people, not many, have shown, you can do the plumbing with some poetry. If you like, the plumber who can sing Rigoletto.
As long as you've got the art of politics, as Bevan.
Quite. Yes, that's right. Because part of the political challenge in democracy is to make engagement in the democratic process, even the tired and wearing necessity of organization and fundraising and all the rest of it, if you can make that appealing by concentrating on making your actions, your policies, your efforts resonate with the real lives of the main body of people. And that's what Bevan did, and did it magically. And I think that that is the combination that's essential in order to rouse people, to make them understand the vitality of democratic politics, and to demonstrate that their effort and their votes were worthwhile because they result in tangible improvement in the general well-being of humankind, which in my view is the objective of being in politics, and it's certainly fundamental to my beliefs as a democratic socialist. So what did I do? Well, I tried as best I could to provide the resonance in language and action, but I developed a reputation, of which I'm quite proud, as a plumber, necessarily in the time in which I was leader of the Labour Party, a very fundamental reformist, because so much had to change in the party that I inherited in 1983, in terms of policy certainly, in terms of constitution and rules, in terms of philosophy, in terms of finance, in terms of its mentality. And people tell me that at the end of that 8.5 years in which I used up my 40s and went through my midlife crisis, I did make changes which made a big difference. And then, such is fate, a couple of years after that, I became the Commissioner for Transport in the European Commission and had to make changes that put the single market in transport into much greater effect, in aviation, in shipping, in the movement of rail freight, road freight. Some of it was hugely successful. Other parts of it are still going on and will take a long time. And then on the basis of that, I was appointed Vice President and had to reform the whole administration of the European Civil Service. Never an easy task, but I have to say, 10 years after I completed the installation of those reforms, because I had to design the reforms and secure the changes in policy and law to make them effective, and then implement them in practice. 10 years later, 11 years later, it does appear that they are working, although there's always a need in any organization, public or private, small or large, to sustain the evolution to higher levels of performance by everybody. So I hope that's going on as well.
And Neil Kinnock, you had that art of politics, which was that you had that spontaneity in a way to communicate with the electorate. So why it never allowed you to reach the highest office to become the prime minister there?
Well, there are some broad reasons for that, and they may have to do with my own inadequacies. They may have to do with the exaggeration of my inadequacies, or indeed the invention of other inadequacies. But basically, what I was trying to do, and gain some advance in doing, but not enough, is to first of all change policy and practice in the Labour Party, and then get recognition of the reality that they were deep-rooted and meaningful. They would be the programme for government, and they weren't opportunistic or cosmetic in any way. And of course, in part of that I succeeded, but there's always a danger in making fundamental changes that you will be regarded, or at least represented by your enemies, as making superficial change, not deep-rooted change. And part of my task was to try to convince the electorate that the changes were meaningful and with the grain of their hopes and aspirations. And I didn't do that sufficiently well. So that was one reason why I failed to win the 1992 election, despite all the changes. The other reason, I guess, is much more prosaic, and that is that the Conservative Party, seeing Margaret Thatcher and their party lagging behind us by substantial margins in poll after poll, by-election after by-election, local elections, European elections, decided to get rid of it. And they did by just one vote. And I said to my people on the night that Thatcher was toppled that we should celebrate that night at the departure of a divisive and ruinous character, but that we should wake up the next morning knowing that our greatest electoral asset had gone, and we were going to have to deal with a much milder form of conservatism, more appealing form of conservatism, in the shape of John Major. And so it turned out that Mr. Major was able to do two things. One, to convince people that the great change that they wanted had come and they could safely go on voting Conservative, which they did. And secondly, that he was a man with a decent mission, which I have no reason to doubt. I mean, I disagree fundamentally on many things with John Major, but he certainly was a decent and sincere man who did believe in a moderate form of pro-European Christian democracy in the classic, pragmatic British Conservative way. And on that basis, he was able to get enough votes to defeat us by 21. It was still an accomplishment. I got the Tories down from a majority of 140 odd to 21. We were 1,450 votes behind them in their bottom 11 marginal seats in 1992. But
it was an accomplishment there.
Sure, but nevertheless, history is written by winners.
Oh, you paved the way that for another.
Sure, but I wanted to win because, as the subsequent 5 years demonstrated, Britain really needed a government that was committed to investment-led recovery, to generating high-skilled employment, to introducing much greater equity in the education and higher standards and breadth of service in the health service, as well as combating poverty. All of it entirely feasible, all of it essential then and indeed now. And therefore, my disappointment related not so much to my own individual personal dismay, though that was obviously there, wouldn't be a human being if I didn't feel that, but much, much more to the avoidable weaknesses and difficulties that we could have helped to overcome had we been elected in 92, but it wasn't to be.
But in 1983, when you became the leader of the Labour Party, you wanted to get the party again electable, but it's only since 1987 that you saw a change within your party, but it was not as sufficient enough to win the 92 election. So don't you think that change was needed since from the beginning, 1983?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We didn't leave ourselves enough time, and I was constantly concerned by that, agitated by it, outraged by it. But I can give you some reasons, not excuses. I got elected in October 1983, and I knew the program of change that we had to make in terms of our defence policy, our policy towards the European community as it then was, our policy on the sale of council houses, very mundane but very, very basic and central in British politics, our policy on public ownership, which meant that we simply had to tell the truth about it and dismantle all the lies told about it, and changes in other ways in the conduct of the party, finances and much else. So I knew what we had to do, and I had my own agenda for doing it, and started immediately, for instance, with starting to change the policy on the European community. Now, because people's feelings had run so deep that they were almost religious in their antagonism to Europe, I knew I was going to have to turn the tanker around relatively slowly in order to stop it breaking in half. That certainly applied to other areas. I'm just giving this as an example. So, by the degree, I started to secure the changes. On the sale of council houses, I had to act more rapidly and confront those who wanted to retain the outdated and unrealistic policies of forbidding council house sales, which had never been universal. Labour councils had been selling council houses for years and years and years, and using, crucially, the income, the revenue from the sale, to build new houses, affordable new houses, and to renovate existing housing stock. Now, under the Conservative law, that was expressly forbidden. They could sell the houses at a discount, and I didn't have any difficulty with that. I was brought up in a council house myself. But what was unforgivable was the fact that councils were then forbidden from using the revenue earned from the sale of the houses for the improvement of housing stock and the enlargement of housing stock. And it was that policy that left us with the results of gross undersupply of affordable housing, which we're suffering from in our country now. So that had to be changed. And it did mean a knockdown, drag-out fight at every level, and eventually by the conference of 1984, a year later, I managed to secure the policy that I wanted. However, in the meantime, the National Mine Workers Work to Rule had started in November 1984, about 6 weeks after I became the leader. And under the absolutely ill-advised, foolish, suicidal leadership of Arthur Scargill, by the following March, April, that had turned into a national strike without a democratic ballot. They started the strike at the end of the winter instead of the beginning of the winter. They did it without a mandate, and they relied on mass picketing in order to try to secure the shutdown of the British coal mining industry. And therefore, the whole strike was doomed from the outset, and my only deep, deep regret, apart from the fact that the strike took place and devastated coal mining communities and families, is that I didn't say publicly, right from the outset, what I was saying privately, including to the miners' leadership, that unless you have a ballot, unless you get a mandate, then you're going to be isolated and overwhelmed by the state and by Tory preparations in the form of national policing, and even more in the coal stocks that they'd increased by about 30% in preparation for the strike. And so it occurred. But what it meant is for the labour movement a total, understandable, total preoccupation with the strike and everything that went with it, the isolation of communities, the deprivation of families. And that lasted for the whole year of the strike, but it lasted for months before the strike, and it certainly resonated for months after the strike. So we lost maybe as much as 20 months out of the 4 years between 1983 and 1987, when virtually no one was willing to think about or focus on policy change. So we arrived at the 1987 election without having made the scope and scale of the changes that were, in my view, essential. And the tragedy was that the labour movement needed another instruction from defeat, a smaller defeat, but nevertheless a substantial defeat in 1987, before eventually I could get enough in the crucial parts of the movement, the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party and one or two other places, the leadership of some of the trade unions, to think in terms of change. And we got the policy review underway, and by 1989, 2 years, we'd made huge changes in policy. I'd fought and conquered the ultra-left, changed the rules of the party, put the Labour Party on a very firm financial footing, and we were ready for combat. The problem was that even by making the major changes in the spring of 89, well, really by the autumn of 89, we still hadn't left ourselves the time to ensure that understanding of those changes and the policy proposals we were making on investment and on revenue raising, on taxation, really understood. And that would have been difficult in any circumstances because of the antagonism of much of the British press. But it was made even more difficult by the fact that we'd taken so long to do it, and that we'd left ourselves such little time to get the understanding of what we were seriously seeking to do fully understood. And in the end, that was crucial, that was definitive.
You had an opportunity to become the Prime Minister. It was in 1986, and it was over the crisis, over Westland Affair, and two of Lady Thatcher's ministers had already resigned, Michael Heseltine, Defence Secretary, and Trade and Industry Secretary in Britain. And before going to that debate in the House of Commons with you, Lady Thatcher turned to one of her advisors and she told him that I may not be the Prime Minister in the next few hours. So what had changed since that debate with you, that she regained confidence and then she remained Prime Minister?
Well, the idea that the government was in danger then is fiction, total fiction. The government rocked on its huge majority, but there was no possibility under any circumstances of Margaret Thatcher going. Her party wouldn't have ejected her, and she certainly wouldn't have volunteered to go. And without victory in a vote of confidence, which was mathematically as well as politically impossible, that government would not have been ended. Now, in that crisis you speak of, the so-called Western crisis, I led the attack against the government. Their insecurity was fueled by a debate we had the week before, the crucial one that you're speaking of, because I had pretty resoundingly won that debate and they had no answers. When it came to the debate, I made a huge mistake, very uncharacteristically. I'd actually written the speech on the previous day, and when I went into the House of Commons to put some final touches, I made the mistake of adding about a page to the front of the speech. which added to the length, made me less confident about delivery, and in the second paragraph I slipped up, and this matters in the House of Commons, idiotically, by describing as Michael Heseltine as the Right Honourable Member for Westland instead of his constituency of wherever it was, in Oxfordshire somewhere. And of course that produced catcalls. I was temporarily destabilised. The speech, if you read it, was an absolutely first-class analysis and denunciation of Tory policy. There were all kinds of questions that I put that weren't answered. But when Margaret Thatcher got up, it meant that our side was dismayed, as spineless people often are, quite easily. And the other side scented the possibility that they were going to appear to win a victory that day. And appearances count. And that's what happened. In the medium term, even in the short term, it made virtually no difference to the standing of the government or of the opposition or of Margaret Thatcher. And the whole of the experience was temporarily overblown and has since been put into perspective. It's pretty natural that someone either produced or invented the idea of Margaret Thatcher in an extreme state of nervousness, saying that she might not be the Prime Minister at the end of the day. But absolutely no evidence whatsoever exists to substantiate that claim. And it would have been, apart from anything else, wholly out of character for Margaret Thatcher to have folded that easily.
And in 1997, when Tony Blair became the Prime Minister, and we just talked about that you made those changes and paved the way for Tony Blair to become the Prime Minister. First, did he thank you for all those changes? And then, what do you make of New Labour? Is it what you would have done if you had become the Prime Minister?
Tony was generous enough, publicly and privately, on several occasions, to thank me and pay tribute for the changes made. I think I summarise him when he said, after he became Prime Minister, I wear this mantle because of what Neil Kinnock did. So he couldn't be more direct than that, which was very kind and very fulfilling when he said it. My reservation about this truly brilliant politician and very nice man. He was what people call one of my protégés. I encouraged him and Gordon Brown and some others from the first day they were in Parliament, gave them positions on the front bench very early on, and was full of optimism about their future as very attractive and challenging social democrats, democratic socialists. And those feelings remain, feelings of affection remain. The difficulty that I have and the reservations I have relate to the reluctance or unwillingness of Tony to fully comprehend the scale of the victory that he won in 1997 and the reasons for it. Yes, as in every democracy. He won partly because people didn't want the government, and so they voted against the government. But a lot of them also voted for Labour and what they believed to be its radical potential in terms of changing, if you like, the equipment of the British economy and society to make it a more efficient and competitive place, certainly, but one that was ruled in the name of justice. The phrase that I coined back in the early 90s was economic efficiency and social justice, and that was the appeal that Tony Blair's New Labour had. On the question of New Labour,
No.
you'll have to edit that, of New Labour, I had absolutely no difficulty because I tirelessly explained to doubting Labour audiences, the phrase I used was, if it ain't new, it ain't Labour. That going back to Keir Hardie, one of the founders of the party, his novelty, his innovation was gigantic by comparison with anything that had been done since. Keir Hardie and George Bernard Shaw and the suffragettes and Ramsay MacDonald and the urgent, almost revolutionary fervour was certainly New Labour. Claimant Attlee, in what he did after the war, was very definitely innovative and bold, New Labour. Harold Wilson, in 1964, after 13 years of Conservative rule, in the whole approach that he took to trying to make government the fount of growth and justice, definitely New Labour. Even the minority government of the 70s made significant changes that would never have been made by the Conservatives in things like industrial health and safety and our commitment to the European community and several New Labour. So I had no difficulty at all, and certainly what I did was definitely innovation and New Labour, so I had no difficulty with that. The problem is that in not fully comprehending and acting upon the dimension of change for which people had voted, the government became hesitant about just about everything except for the massively necessary and huge additional investment in health and education and combating poverty. But it didn't sponsor the advance in productivity that was needed. It didn't bring about the proper regulation of the market economy, which was necessary to protect serious innovatory enterprise and not have the fruits reaped by the financial sector solely, and several other changes. Its house building record was poor, despite the fact that that was a seriously essential investment that was necessary not only in itself, but also to generate supply and thereby moderate price increases and rent increases in the private sector, and the generating of skills and jobs and incomes in every part of the economy. So I'm not just picking holes, I'm saying that with greater audacity and a stronger sense of transformative purpose, big changes, much bigger changes, could have been made in addition to the rescue of the health and education systems, which is what it was, and the development that did take place. So I'm concerned about that. I'm also concerned, obviously, about the external policy of that government. Very early on, in friendly conversations with Tony, I said that it was crucially important for him to make real friends amongst the leaderships of the remainder of the European community, then altogether coming up to 15 countries. It was still only 11 when he became, no, it was 15 when he became leader, including Britain, because so much of the daily business and the long-term development of the United Kingdom and Europe depended upon the quality of collective leadership in the European community. That's still the case, it always will be the case. And that leadership was necessary because Helmut Kohl was coming to the end of his time, François Mitterrand had effectively gone, their replacements were not going to build the networks and the combined strength necessary to lead Europe, and so it fell to a pro-European, enlightened social democratic leadership from the UK to really instigate the advance and change necessary in the European community. And in the short term, at the outset, Tony accepted that. And then it started to falter. And I asked why, and I was told by one of his close advisors, "You're absolutely right, Neil, but there's no bloody votes." He didn't quite put it like that, but he said, "There's no bloody votes in foreign policy." And I said, "Well, that's often true, except when things go wrong. And when they do go wrong, only foreign policy counts." And I'm afraid not enough attention was paid to the developments in an increasingly globalized world, where there were new menaces, and it meant therefore that there was too strong an inclination to follow the misguided leadership of George Bush and his associates, and that's what took us into Iraq, not only in the wrong circumstances, but crucially, even more important, because I wanted to see the end of Saddam Hussein. I wanted to see it at the time of the first Desert Storm, and argued for it. But it had been explained to me quite sincerely and authentically by both George Bush Sr. and John Major that they were engaged in a very short-term operation to exclude Iraq from Kuwait, and they had not had the time to develop logistically what was necessary, and that is a means of effectively governing Iraq in an enlightened and productive way. They didn't use those words, but that's what they meant, in the wake of Saddam Hussein. So they couldn't finish the war in Baghdad, which is what I was arguing for. So I knew that we'd have to go back. I thought it'd be 3 or 4 years. I didn't think it'd be a dozen years, but it was a dozen years. And still the crucial need for what happened after the war was won, inevitably won by our superior forces, what was going to happen to Iraq and in Iraq afterwards. And I argued for a denazification program, if you like, just like 1945 in Germany, Japan and Italy, where the civil service and the teaching force stayed intact, the police force stayed intact, and you relied upon the junior people in the Ba'athist party who joined in order to put food on the family table, just like some of the Nazis in Germany and the fascisti in Italy and the supporters of the emperor in Japan, in the short term, in order to be able to get evidence on, capture and prosecute the really big criminals who were running Iraq. I was given undertakings that that was definitely going to be the case, and of course it turned out to be fiction, despite the plan put together very intelligently by the Colin Powell, which was completely overwritten and ignored. And I think that failure came out of inadequate attention to external affairs, comprehension of the world in which we live, despite the example given in 1945 and the years afterwards. It was ignored. And the result is an enduring tragedy in Iraq and therefore in the cauldron of the Middle East. So those reservations, those difficulties, and a couple associated with it, mean I have a sense not of anger but of disappointment at a hope unfulfilled, despite the massive majorities and great popularity and consequently potential power exercised by that new Labour government.
And disappointed of new Labour, Tony Blair's new Labour government. How about Ed Miliband's Labour government? Some people, they say that trade unions are becoming more influential than they were since 30 years ago, because they are dictating policies to the Labour Party, so therefore that's why they are anti-business and they are anti-social progress. What do you make of that?
Fantasy. From day one, because of the electoral system that exists in the Labour Party, and the fact that Ed got substantial support from the trade union vote, the press have wanted to characterize him as Red Ed, which is absurd, indeed insultingly absurd. Because if you look at the record, what you'll see is that he's insisted on reform of trade unions within the Labour Party successfully. He's insisted on less dependence on trade union finance, which is a very difficult thing to do at a time when every political party obviously needs money. And he's ensured that where there's been evidence of possible malpractice or unacceptable behavior by trade unions, that he's denounced it and completely dismissed it. So the idea that Ed is some kind of trade union puppet has got absolutely no substance. On the contrary, he's a very independent-minded leader of the Labour Party in difficult times, which is all to his credit. He's shown in other spheres, of course, also terrific bravery in the way in which he's taken on big targets like the Murdoch Press, the Daily Mail, the energy companies, the banks, and said, not out of animus towards individuals, but because we do need a reshaping of power and accountability in British society. One of the consequences of the way in which things have been run is a widening gap of inequality. Even the OECD and the IMF have expressed disquiet about that. So we manifestly need change in the financial system and the way in which a lot of substantial parts of the economy are run by oligopolies, by, in my view, pricing deals and sweetheart agreements of various kinds, very difficult to prove, but too coincidental to be not believed. And certainly the press, though less important than it used to be, partly through its own fault, partly through changes in technology, is nevertheless a substantial shaper of some opinion, not the majority opinion, but enough to make a difference. Taking them on and their vested interests on requires a lot of guts, a lot of imagination, a lot of insight. And Ed has really shown that. Most importantly, he is, as the Guardian and the Financial Times have acknowledged, the only one of the current political crop of leaders to have shown insight about the unsustainability of the power structure, the taxation system in our country, and the way in which, if we are really going to be equipped for the 21st century, we've got to change our emphasis on education, including so-called vocational education, on science and technology, on medium and long-term investment, and make other changes that are essential in order to achieve a higher level of economic efficiency, which is fundamental to a different scale of social justice and realistic aspiration. So I have supported Ed since before he ran for the leadership because of these qualities of high intelligence, courage, approachability, and above all, coolness. The guy's cool. He's calm, even under quite excessive and often unfair pressure. And I just look at the times in which we live and the world in which we live, and I think to myself, in these stormy conditions, who do you want on the bridge? David Cameron, the Arch of Pisa, the guy who's always looking for the easy route and mistakes headlines for solutions, and throws tantrums, and is characteristically a bully, or tries to be, or Ed Miliband, Mr. Smart, Mr. Brave, Mr. Cool. And I know what the answer is.
And my last question is, how do you foresee the future of Scotland, of United Kingdom as a whole, after the Scottish referendum and government's proposal on English MPs, on English votes?
I have to go back a bit to the 1970s. Insofar as I made a national reputation, it was initially from about 1978 on, because of my antagonism to the form of devolution then being proposed by the 1970s Labour government. It was that devolution be granted to Scotland and to Wales. My argument was twofold. One, if decentralisation of decision making and greater accountability is to be supported, and it is, no Democrat can think otherwise, then it must be for the whole kingdom and not for sliced off bits of it. That was in the name of common sense, good governance, equity, because the problems or the strengths of different parts of the kingdom paid no attention to boundaries. They had to do with industrial heritage, the development of the economy, the imbalances in the economy, distance and so on. And they all had to be addressed. And part of the way, only a small part of the way of addressing them, was to release, through accountability, inventiveness. And that should apply to the whole UK. Secondly, if they did go ahead with what I called so-thumb devolution, they would not kill nationalism and counter-nationalism, the disagreements within the kingdom, as they claimed. They would actually feed separatism. And they would feed it because the day would arrive where in Edinburgh especially, more so than Cardiff, and I'm a Welshman and fought devolution because I had a Welsh constituency and I believed it would be grossly against the interests of my constituency, moving out of being a coal mining and steel producing constituency, hopefully into being a modern industrial part of the industrial economy. That hasn't quite happened yet. It's improved, but it's not where it should be. But Scotland, a different proposition, distance, substantial devolution already with its legal system and its local government structure, and having the oil offshore. My view was that if there was, as there surely would be, a government in Edinburgh, not necessarily nationalist, that was antagonistic to decision making in Whitehall, and in Whitehall and Westminster there was a government that really didn't give a damn about whether Scotland was part of the kingdom as long as there was a share in the oil revenues and they recognised the Queen. That would be an equation that was bound to be combustible. And I made the argument on that basis with all of its sub-arguments. In Wales, we won the referendum which I campaigned for on the 1st of March 1979 by 4-1 in my constituency, by 9-1 in a 60-odd% turnout. In Scotland there was a mathematical majority for devolution, but they failed to get the threshold of 60% vote in favour. And consequently, devolution made no further progress. I said it's gone for this generation, but not for all generations. And sure enough, it came back. So what we've got now is almost exactly the combination of circumstances that I forecast. As it happens with a nationalist government in Scotland, seeking separation, able to convince quite a lot of people that things couldn't be worse, and in fact they could have a Nordic social democracy north of Hadrian's Wall, total fantasy, but they got a lot of people to believe it. And a government in London that is feeding separatism by trying to take opportunistic advantage of what's happening in Scotland by saying English votes for English laws. So they are willing to smash up the union for the sake of getting potentially a small majority in Parliament. Okay, I don't know what you lost, but I was saying the Scottish nationalists claim that a separate Scotland, and I wish we'd used the word secession or separation rather than independence, which is a virile concept. I can understand why the Nazis use it. I don't know why anybody else is daft enough to use it. I never do. But a seceded, separatist Scotland, they claim, would be a social democratic Nordic democracy. Now, it might be a democracy, but it is preponderantly dependent upon the flow of public expenditure from the rest of the United Kingdom and anticipated oil revenues. Those revenues, with the fall in the price of oil, have been cut in half by comparison with what they claimed revenues were going to be. And so what we could foresee easily, authentically, as a separate Scotland is one that has lost a major source of fiscal support and is so dependent on a dwindling oil revenue base that it would be deferring to 5 or 6 very large multinationals. And the only question they would ever have to ask those companies is, how high do you want us to jump? Now, the idea in those circumstances that they are an independent, ancient, developed over decades Nordic democracy is nonsense. And whilst those Nordic democracies have, over the decades, built a high level of tax dependency, which is their people's choice, in order to fund very comprehensive public services, excellent education, the nourishment of talent and brains to make their way in the modern world, which is how they do it, and have made the transition from rust economies to being high-tech, forward-looking economies. They've done all of that, but they've taken a long time to do it. Time that Scotland would not have at its disposal. So I just hope that before we get to the general election, people in Scotland in greater numbers recognise that by playing with separation or even quasi-separation, they are gambling with the future of every family, community and company in the country. I just hope they realise that, because otherwise they could doom themselves to huge difficulty and a Tory government in London scarcely able to contain its impatience for getting a separate Scotland and removing Scottish votes as a force for good and progress in British political economy. And so I think there's a lot to fight for in this election. As I say, without any sense of self-justification or indeed celebration. I'm sorry I was right about it. I'm really sorry I was right about it. But it's come to pass. And it could get worse before it gets better.
We hope that nationalists and the government will listen to you and consider very seriously what you just told me. Thank you very much, Neil Kinnock, for your time. It was a great pleasure. Thanks
for your
very
time.
much.
Okay, and thanks for your questions.